MicroStrategy is the first Bitcoin Treasury companies. They raise funds, then buy Bitcoin.
About a 2,400% increase in share price over the last 5 years.
The company is very risky, very difficult to validate objectively and intrinsically.
There's potential for huge innovation with lots of different Bitcoin-type products.
If you're not paying a dividend or building any debt, and people are paying a share price which is several times the value of the underlying Bitcoin, so you're able to buy the Bitcoin at a discount. I think that's actually quite smart.
But if there's an extreme exogenous shock, what would happen?
Welcome to the latest episode of the Intelligent Wealth Podcast. And as usual, my eminent guests here are Carl Roberts, who's a fellow director of fund management company, Minerva Money Management, and our head of research, no less, Awet Gourmet. So, just to remind listeners that this podcast is for serious investors who are looking for additional information, research, opinions to support their own research into what is usually quality investing type companies. Today's a bit of an exception because we're going to be covering a company called Strategy, previously known as MicroStrategy. More about that in a moment. What we don't want you to do is to take any of our opinions today as advice, because in our experience, when you follow other people's tips, it usually goes wrong because we're all built differently. We've all got different timescales and different attitudes to investment risk. It always pays to do your own research. But if we can be a good aid to your own research, then we've fulfilled our function, really. So without any further ado, let me just introduce the company we're going to discuss today. It's not a company owned by our fund, the Intelligent Wealth Fund, but it's a company called Strategy, previously known as MicroStrategy. Now, just to give you a bit of background, MicroStrategy is the first of one of the so-called Bitcoin Treasury companies. You may be wondering, what the heck is that? Basically, it's a company that typically will have had a different trading history in the past. Maybe it's a failed business model that no longer works. That's typically what happens. But they've built up a pile of cash, typically, and they're reinventing themselves. So this is exactly what's happened with Strategy, that was previously in the software business, business intelligence software, mobile apps, cloud analytics. They still do some of that, but it's a very small part of their overall business now. They've transformed into this Bitcoin treasury company. What they do is they raise funds by issuing debt, corporate bonds, that is. It could be convertible bonds. It could be shares that they issue. And the funds they raise from that, they then buy into Bitcoin. They just keep doing that. It's just literally every month, they just keep buying more and more Bitcoin. So they become the biggest corporate owner of Bitcoin globally. Carl and Awet will give you the figures to cover that. They were formed in 1989. Michael Saylor was one of the three founders. The other two you don't hear about so much, Sanju Bansai and Thomas Sparr. They're now worth, the market value is about $110 billion, which is more than the value of their Bitcoin. It's about 30-40% premium at least. As I say, Carl and Awet will go into more of the actual information in more detail than I'm doing here. So that's just a brief introduction. So really, over to you, Carl, to take us through some of the figures.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Well, if we look at performance, first of all, so since the early 2001, the price of a share in MicroStrategy, as it was then, was hovering around $3 a share. And then it hovered between about $2 and $20 for the next kind of 19, 20 years, up until about 5 years ago, when the prices really took off. So back in August 2020, the price was around $14.50 per share. And today, at the time of recording, it's around $363 per share, which, if our maths is correct, is about a 2,400% increase, total increase in share price over the last 5 years. So if you'd bought a load of Strategy shares 5 years ago and you sat on them for 5 years, you've done really well. obviously you've mentioned a Bitcoin Treasury company mainly today. If we compare that rate of performance to Bitcoin itself, the Bitcoin in the last 5 years, priced in dollars, the price has only, I say only, but it's only gone up 888%. So Bitcoin itself has gone up 888% in 5 years versus MicroStrategy, or Strategy as it is now, has gone up 2,405%. So something interesting is going on with this company, which is why obviously we're talking about it today. In terms of its Bitcoin holdings, it's just absolutely ahead of anyone else. There's an interesting website actually I came across, which is called bitcointreasuries.net. And with this website, it kind of ranks the top 100 companies that hold Bitcoin in their treasury, and it actually tells you how many Bitcoin they've got. So we've got Strategy absolutely at number one today with around 630,000 Bitcoins. Does anyone know what the next company is, or what the Bitcoin holding is for the next company, next highest?
If I had access to your notes, Carl, I could cheat and tell you. I suspect it's substantially lower, somewhere in the region of maybe 100,000.
Well, it's a company called Mara Holdings, and they actually hold 50,000 Bitcoins. So compared to, say, Strategy, 630,000. So there's no one even coming close to this same level as Strategy, what Strategy have done over the last kind of 5 years or so. Interestingly, when you look down the list, there is quite a few companies you might recognize that are holding quite chunky Bitcoin treasuries. So Tesla, for example, is number 11 on the list. They've got around 11,500 Bitcoins in their treasury. GameStop, do you remember them from the Wall Street, kind of going after Wall Street and things? They're now up to just under 5,000 Bitcoins. Another company that we like, Mercado Libre, is on this list. I've just lost it. Oh, where they are. Yeah, number 50 on the list. Mercado Libre, 570 Bitcoins. So yeah, there's a few companies that you probably recognize. Coinbase, number 10 on the list. Coinbase has got 11,000. But again, just no one comes close to just Strategy there. So it's worth mentioning that, just because it's important. We'll come into kind of discussions later on in terms of their competitive advantage and the business model. So yeah, so Dave, how you want to add anything on that at this stage?
Yeah, I think if you think about it, MicroStrategy was the first Bitcoin treasury company in the world. I think that's why they accumulated all these coins over the years. They have the first mover advantage in comparison to other companies. But the problem we have is traditionally we value companies by discounting their future earnings, such as assets and so on. So I think with MicroStrategy, because it doesn't have much of earning, it's just difficult to value. It makes it like as an art. Is the whole Bitcoin idea is based on resellable value, someone who will be paying more in the future. So it's very difficult to value the company objectively and intrinsically as well. So it seems to me all this the MicroStrategy idea is is driven by investor psychology. It's driven by optimism on the future. Bitcoin will be, it's going to change the world. And there's a certain element as well, the psychology of the fear of missing out, which drives investors. And that's why when you compare it, Bitcoin and MicroStrategy, you can see there's a huge difference between Bitcoin and MicroStrategy. And that's pretty much driven by FOMO, fear of missing out. But the reality is, as Ben Graham once said, in the short run, the market are a voting machine. In the long run, is a waiting machine. So the reality is, the future will decide of MicroStrategy valuation. But what we see is, I think Tony, you mentioned earlier, is MicroStrategy, their business model was failing and they couldn't find anything to do. What they did realize is they had some cash and they just decided to find buying Bitcoin. I think that's what they have done. So the company itself, it doesn't produce anything apart from just buying Bitcoin and just continue to raise money and buy Bitcoin over time and continue to do it. It's a vicious cycle. So it's just it just makes you wonder, is it like a bubble, or what would happen if a Bitcoin price just dropped 50% and suddenly there's no way they can raise money, because we know during the recession or financial uncertainty, it's quite difficult to raise money. So the company is quite very risky system that they're heading into. And I think historically, this company has rewarded investors who invested in MicroStrategy early on. But the problem we have is for how long this is going to continue. You have to keep raising money to work the system to work. And it's difficult to see how long that has to continue the system to work.
Well, why do they have to keep raising money? Why can't they just stop now and just wait for Bitcoin to rise in value?
Yeah, I mean, because as a company, if you don't have a product or service, all you have to rely is a phase that you believe Bitcoin have to rise in the future. So the reality is, we know the market, we've been in the market. It's difficult to predict something would rise in the future, especially when something is have a lot of speculative element like Bitcoin. So they do not have the product. I mean, if you look at their software business in the last 10 years, the earning has been flat. It's just pretty much, it's not making it hasn't been growing. And that's pretty much why they realize there's a market for Bitcoin, and they just keep pumping Bitcoin and just keep raising money and doing it. And I think recently, if you look at the earning report, they have raised, I think they have increased how much they will be raising. They will be raising around 20 billion now. So they have to keep raising the target in order for this system to work. Otherwise, in the long run, it just doesn't work. Because you could probably take the investment that we do in other companies. Those companies have a product that we rely on, like Microsoft, for example, one of our investment. They have a product, they have a software, they have so many businesses that everyone is ingrained in all businesses. And even the podcast that we're doing is just pretty much using one of their software. But with MicroStrategy, what do you have? They don't have any product or services. All is Bitcoin. And you have to, if you believe, if you're bull on Bitcoin, it's a company to invest in. At the same time as well, you are paying premium for it. So why not just own Bitcoin?
Good point, Carl. What's your counter to that?
I think it's worth.
Well, as I didn't know the answer.
I think it's worth stepping back a bit and mentioning. So Michael Saylor, obviously, I don't know the guy. I can only go on what we see and read. He's completely bought into Bitcoin as a concept and all of the things he sees behind that. So in terms of it being, true sort of money, he obviously speaks a lot about the problems with the fiat system. So I think that's how he originally came into Bitcoin. Was he wasn't running a failing business, is worth pointing out. He was just running a zombie company, essentially. It was ticking over. It was quite decent cash flow. He just had a load of cash in his treasury, but he couldn't grow it any further. So he was like, well, this company could survive another 20, 30, 50 years just ticking along. But where does he put that cash? And that's obviously led him then down a Bitcoin path, because he was thinking, right, cash is just depleting every year through inflation and things like that. So he was like, I'm looking for an asset that I'm going to be able to, hold my company's treasury in. And then he come across Bitcoin. So he's fully into Bitcoin. He fully, as a true believer, as I see it from what he says, obviously he could be lying and treating us all for fools, but the way he comes across is he definitely believes in Bitcoin and all the problems that's wrong with fiat system. So why is that important? Is because I think down the line, his scope for making money is to turn Bitcoin into a financial product. And that could be by some sort of Bitcoin bank, even just innovation into Bitcoin products that we can't even foresee yet or understand. He's already started it with a couple of bond kind of concepts. So there's a couple of other products you can buy on the market from Strategy. They've all got quite funny names: one Stretch, one Strike, and one Strife. And it's all a way of them raising money to buy more Bitcoin, but they're quite innovative in the way they're paying out their dividends or coupons. So again, he's starting to put innovative products into the market using his Bitcoin reserves. And if you think he's far ahead of anyone else with the Bitcoin reserves, he can effectively control that market because no one's going to be able to catch up with him unless one of the Magnificent Seven start going into this. None of them have got the treasuries that and the backing that Strategy have got. So I think that's potentially where you could see this changing from just purely buying Bitcoin and hoping it carries on rising to actually making profits and money from just innovative Bitcoin style financial products. That's where I potentially see the future going for Strategy. But you have to believe in Bitcoin for it to work. Obviously, it's not going to work if Bitcoin fails and something else comes along and everyone stops kind of buying it and ends up selling it, because that would destroy the business model. But I don't think the end game is just to constantly just keep buying Bitcoin and just hope it rises.
Right. Yeah, I think the idea of a business is to produce something, product or service to the marketplace and to improve society. But looking purely on MicroStrategy, what I do see is, it creates, more complexity. If you look at their balance sheet, of course, they have, Bitcoin valued around 73 billion, and they have a long-term debt of, 8.2 billion. But when you look at as you mentioned, Carl, as well, what they have recently updated their system is like they have come up with this complex perpetuity strikes and financial engineering. And I do think, I think what you learn from Warren Buffett and Charlie is they are making it more complex. And I think the more complex they make it, they just making it more difficult for investors to understand. And that's how they keep, as I mentioned earlier, you keep raising money, you make it more complex. 8%, 10% perpetual, preferred stocks. What would happen? How would they pay it if the market corrected 8%? 50%. How would you get money? You have to sell the Bitcoin at that price. There's a lot of certain of risky element here I see. And historically, when we analyze, I think one time I was reading this research, when you look at around why company fail, the biggest thing you find is excessive amount of debt. And I think this seems to be one of those elements. I can see there's an excessive debt, excessive risk, going all in into one product, which is its feature is very unknowable. And I think it's very high risk strategy in my view. But that doesn't mean that this is not going to continue. It can continue until how long, we don't know exactly. But the reality is at some point, this system, it might fail to work. But we don't know when.
It's got a lot of debt, but the debt is 8.2 billion, but the value of their Bitcoin holdings is about 67 billion.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't strike me as a high amount of debt, unless Bitcoin goes down to zero in value.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is, as we said, is relying on one product. There's like a lot of uncertainty with one product. If there's an exogenous shock and the product suddenly dropped by 80%, let's say, suddenly the debt they have to collect it. And I think you are in a really difficult, how do you pay that? Because you are paying dividend on this stuff, perpetuity, which means you're paying it until, which is forever in my view. But they will, at some point they have the conversion, they have to be converted into stocks, but we don't know when. So there are a lot of complexity, and I see here in this business. And even when we look at around Bitcoin, there's a lot of uncertainty. Imagine, we don't know where the Bitcoin is held, for example. If there's a cybersecurity breach, cyber attack, fraud, and so on, we don't even know where this Bitcoin is held. So there's a significant risk I see. But with other business, when we invest, we know we use their product. We know they got their money there. But this is purely relying on Bitcoin. And don't get me wrong. I think if you're bullish on Bitcoin, you think this is the only way it's going to solve the fiat system. Yes, it's one stock that you can bet on. But in my view, I do think it's better to look for other companies that are doing more innovation, building some product that really meaningful for society and transition our society and making it better.
Right, for the listeners there, you can tell already that Awet is a Bitcoin, what do you call it, bear, and Carl and I are the opposite. We're bulls. We're Bitcoin bulls.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's a fair comment. It is very volatile, the price of Bitcoin. We all know that. But Bitcoin, of course, is a bit like Marmite, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Marmite, you either love it or hate it. And most people seem to hate it. And I think it's the same with Bitcoin. It just, like Carl said earlier, it depends on your view of the future of Bitcoin, really, doesn't it? And I'm pretty pessimistic about the future of fiat currency, our existing system of notes and coins, especially with America printing no end of dollars. And most countries in the world, virtually all countries in the world, suffer of currency depreciation. And particularly in the third world, they really, really do struggle enormously. We're sheltered from that pretty much. If you live in the EU or UK, Switzerland, USA, you're probably the most protected because they're probably the strongest currencies alongside the dollar. There's not a huge amount of variability each year. But if you live in say an African country, my goodness me, all your money can just be lost, literally. And although I take your point about Bitcoin, I do think for most countries in the world, fiat money is far, far more risky. And in fact, there are countries where it's actually stolen off you by the government. That's happened many times. And or if that's not happening, then you get inflation at thousands of percent and so on. It's just, you can't underestimate how poor the fiat money system is. And there's a huge amount of debt around the world, isn't there, that's going to destroy countries. So I think I think it's got a future. I think it's going to be hard to ever get rid of Bitcoin, and it's got a limited supply. Personally, I'm optimistic about it in spite of the potential risks. And I feel that the great volatility we've had in the past is going to be very much a thing of the past, because I can see the volatility reducing enormously in the future as the currency becomes more and more a significant asset in the world. It still represents only probably 1% of all worldwide assets. Bitcoin is still relatively small. But I could see it being the savior, really. If the biggest issue is the volatility, isn't it? We've twice had falls of about 80% in the last 7 or 8 years. So I can see what your point about it, Awet. What do you think, Carl? Come on, reveal your Bitcoin bullishness here. Here's your chance.
Yeah, I think that's what it's all down to when it comes to this company. It's you, if you believe in the Bitcoin story and what it's going to do, then you'll sort of understand and kind of buy into probably what strategy you're trying to do. If you're anti-Bitcoin, then why would you? Of course, you're going to think it's too risky because it does rely on Bitcoin. But that's Saylor's. That's his belief. That's what he's completely bought into. Why would you not? He is loading up on fiat currency to go and buy something he thinks, which fiat currency, which he thinks is depreciating every year, to go and buy something that's appreciating every year. So it doesn't really matter how much debt he ends up racking in fiat currency if Bitcoin is appreciating, does it? It just, that's what he sees and ultimately believes. So if Bitcoin doesn't come off, then of course, the company probably will fail until if it fails before he get it kind of profitable and actually making money off kind of Bitcoin and things. So they come together, don't they? Belief in Bitcoin, and then you'll probably like what MicroStrategy doing. It's worth saying as well, though. I think you mentioned is he hasn't got product and things like that. So obviously, if you think Facebook is nothing without the internet, is it? It needed, the internet came along, and all they've done is just use the services of the internet to sort of sell advertisements. There's no kind of real products behind it. Same with Google. Initially, with like Google search and things, it's effectively what he's doing. He's just jumping on the back of new technology, and then eventually, the ultimate aim must be to monetize it. Do you think if he starts launching all of these new innovative debt instruments and things, and what if he then starts, taking a percentage point off the coupon? So he's offering everyone 10%, which they'll love. That's a decent rate. But he's actually, or he markets it 11% and he takes 1%. Do you see what I mean? There's lots of ways you can see him start to make money on this. What if he lends out his Bitcoin to companies and things like that, earns an interest on that? I think you've got to look at them as the ultimate aim being a Bitcoin bank. It's not a case of we're just buying a load of Bitcoin and hope it just keeps rising. I don't think that's the end game of the company.
No.
And just going back to kind of like the Ponzi element, the way you talk it through, yeah, of course, as it stands, that does sound, yeah, it's just getting more money in and then buying Bitcoin and obviously then doing that as a return to shareholders. But it's all fully funded at this moment in time with Bitcoin the price it is. It's not like he's having to get money through the door to then pay the new investors like a Ponzi scheme. He's got a massive amount of asset there, hasn't he? If he needed to, he could sell it all and he'd still have loads spare. So I think there's that. There's also, Ponzi scheme is secretive, isn't it? No one's really sure what's going on. This is a listed, I think about to go into the S&P 500 company, fully regulated, fully audited under the US's SEC. You'd like to think they're regulated enough that they would find anything dodgy going on. But where I do think you have to be careful if you look at Bitcoin Treasury companies more generally, because going back to that list I was looking at earlier, the top 100, the amount of these companies that have just been created just purely to go and buy Bitcoin. The number 100 on the list, it only owns 44 Bitcoin. This is where you could maybe look at it as a bit more of a Ponzi scheme because they just don't have the backing like Strategy have. And they are asking investors for a load of money to go and buy Bitcoin. And then they are having to use new investor money to go and pay the previous investors. So that is where I would be a lot more cautious is on these smaller companies. A bit like the internet again. When the internet came out in 2000s, we had all these companies that just created websites out of nothing. And obviously they all failed. And then eventually you got the quality companies that came out like the Amazons and the Facebooks. And I think you have to be careful with Bitcoin Treasury companies.
Yeah, I think...
sorry to interrupt, but the other thing that Saylor's been doing recently is he's been moving away from bond issuing, which creates debt, to share issuing. Now, I know it dilutes the share price in theory, but he's not now building debt. That's risk capital that investors put into the company to buy the shares. And I'm not sure whether it pays dividends or not. You mentioned it pays dividends. Are you sure?
There
pays
is
dividends.
Yes.
What percentage?
Dividends? 8 and 10% from what I've read. 8 and 10% perpetuity.
Dividends.
Yes.
No, that's on their corporate bond products.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about bonds. I'm talking about equities. The share capital they raise, I doubt they're paying any dividends. If they're not paying any dividends, then that is a really low cost, low risk way of raising capital. If you're raising capital to buy Bitcoin and you're raising it, also think about the price you're getting. You're getting the price, which is probably several times the actual value of the Bitcoin itself. You're using cheap money, really. And if you're not paying a dividend, you're not building any debt in the company. And people are paying a share price, which is several times the value of the underlying Bitcoin. So you're able to buy the Bitcoin at a discount. I mean, I think that's actually quite smart, personally.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, like they have a long-term debt. I think with the financial complexity, what comes is as well, like FTX, they try to do a lot of lending and complex stuff. And we've seen how that ended up, especially during under extreme pressure, exogenous shocks, what we're saying. So there's those sort of things. I think there are sort of companies, they are robust, and there are some companies are vulnerable. I personally, in my category, I pretty much put MicroStrategy as one of those vulnerable. If there's an extreme exogenous shocks, the company is difficult to withstand. Where companies like Alphabet and Microsoft will stand test of time. I think there are differences from good and great company. And I think MicroStrategy is on the extreme risk. If there's an extreme stress, the question is, would they be able to stand and navigate through it? And I personally think it's quite difficult. I think you made a point earlier about the fiat system and so on. I don't think is currency. The fiat system is not designed to preserve wealth. It's just it's designed for transaction. And I think if you use the fiat system and to allocate your capital properly over time, you would appreciate your value more. So, but the idea here is who does put their money in cash. Of course, if you leave your money in cash, over time it will be wiped out. So that's not a smart way to allocate capital. Of course, you have to allocate it in a way that would generate wealth over time, buying property, buying other things. So,
can I make a point there? by even him issuing bonds, he's borrowing money in fiat currency that's going to go down in value in real terms, and buying an asset which has got the best returns of any asset class since it was born in 2009. I did a study of it for a blog I wrote a few months ago, and just before it reached its high. And over the previous 16 years, it had risen 139% a year.
Yeah.
And if you're issuing a bond and paying even 8%, it's peanuts, isn't it? If you pay 8% for debt and you get 139% return, what would you rather have? I mean,
No, you're right. I think looking at historical, as we say, looking at it historically, it does make sense. But however, the idea here is, for how long can this music play for long? Do you think it's going to play to continue? Because when you invest, you're investing in the future. For how long can we raise money and think the price of Bitcoin is going to go to 250 million?
Well, as I said earlier, I think the amount of volatility is going to reduce enormously. It's becoming far more mainstream now. These Bitcoin ETFs, many have been launched. The US is using it as part of their reserves. There's a lot more demand for Bitcoin from Bitcoin Treasury companies, etc., and investors. That it's just because it's so new and there's been so much money going into it in such a short space of time. It's created a lot of volatility, but that volatility will slow down eventually. And when it becomes more akin to other assets that we're used to, like shares and property, once the volatility reduces significantly, and you do get a lot of volatility still in quoted shares, as we know. You know, the value can appreciate and depreciate by 30, 40% a year. You know, that's Warren Buffett's pointed that out. I mean, that's still a huge amount of volatility, but Bitcoin's even higher than that, of course. So just food for thought, really.
Yeah, I think the other way to think about it as well is he's getting money in through debt, which is unlimited in supply, isn't it? You know, money can be constantly printed, and he's put it into something that has a fixed supply of Bitcoin, which we know there's only ever going to be 21 million. So, you know, so he obviously, he needs the Bitcoin price to keep appreciating or not crash. But that's the bet he's making, isn't it? He's saying, well, there's this one asset here that is unlimited in terms of how much it can be printed. I'll put it into something that I know is fixed and there's no more that can be made of. So as long as there's demand for that, its price should increase. Whereas the other thing, its price should constantly decrease, shouldn't it? So that's the way he's
just
looking
to
at
completely,
it.
it's completely changed the tack a little bit in this conversation. Before we went live, we did talk about the history of what was then MicroStrategy, and of course, he was a naughty boy in the early years. He got accused of tax fraud. He never admitted he did commit a tax fraud. It was all to do with where he lived in the States. He claimed that he lived in low tax parts of the United States, and he didn't actually. So he lied about that and had to settle with a big fine. And that there was some misreported earnings from the company in the late 90s before the dot-com boom and bust. So I was personally saying before we went live that leopards don't change their spots. That leaves a question mark against his character. But then Carl did counter that most of these very wealthy entrepreneurs have got some kind of black mark at the start of their careers. So could you expand on that, Carl?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say first was one of the things we always look for when we're investing is we do like these visionary founders, don't we? Skin in the game, that kind of thing. And I would put Saylor currently at there now. I mean, in terms of the Bitcoin world, he is top dog in terms of fan base. I mean, they absolutely love him. He's kind of like the leader for that movement. And you can't deny, looking at that table we said earlier with the Bitcoin Treasury, he's beaten everyone else to it, hasn't he? So there is some, kind of genius trait there that he's spotted and gone for. So I do think he falls into that kind of visionary founder if we start in from strategy with its Bitcoin strategy. Obviously, it's not great to see character flaws, but I think you'll find if you go through all of the top execs, your Bezos, your Zuckerbergs, I think Trump as US president, they've all got some sort of flaws, haven't they? And you just need to decide yourself whether you're comfortable enough with that trade-off, really. What I also did mention earlier is, again, MicroStrategy now, listed company, highly regulated. You would like to think that you just can't, I mean, of course, there's always scams that could go on, but you'd like to think that with that amount of tension that is now on this company, that he wouldn't be able to get away with something like that. But
yeah, and he's not hiding anything, as you pointed out earlier either, is he? He's not like one of these bubbles or Ponzi schemes where it's all hidden from you.
Yeah, he's well into the open. He even says, doesn't he? He says, yeah, if the Bitcoin price does fall to a certain level, he knows that he would have to start selling and things. So it is all out in the open. How much they've borrowed, how much Bitcoin they purchased, what all the rules are for all of his bonds and things. So you've got to make your own judgment as to whether you believe in it or not.
Yeah, I mean, if you follow Marcus Saylor, I think what you find is he's very great storyteller and he's very good speaker. And I think over time he actually created a great followers, like cult-like followers. And I think, as you mentioned as well, if you look at his wealth, I think he did, because as we said, the system only reward for early investors, because he was early into the market, right? That's why he generates quite. I mean, he's a billionaire. I think his net worth is around 7 billion. So the system he created reward, early investors, and it doesn't reward later investors. I think it's like a greater fool theory. At some point, if the system doesn't work, who would get hurt is the person who gets late to the game. And at some point, if the system stop working, the later who got into the game will be hurted. I think that's what I can see here. So that's how he got rich. I mean, he just found a system that works for him in his favor in the price of retail investors, and he's very good at articulating his argument. And I think he did it. I think he tried to persuade Microsoft to buy into Bitcoin, but they weren't interested.
You could say that about any company, though, couldn't you? You'd rather own Apple shares when they were like 10p, wouldn't you? Of course, if you're an early investor in them, you would have done better than if you invest in it now. But it doesn't mean you can't invest in it now, because you're looking for the future, isn't it? And when it comes to investing, one of the things you always want to be doing is forward looking, not backward looking. And you want to go, where's the growth going to come from? So you've got businesses that are well established, your Apples, your Microsoft, obviously you've got a predictable earning stream, but who's to say their businesses carry on, well into the future? They might do, but you've got to make that judgment. You've got to look and say, going forward, where's all the growth going to come from? There's an argument to make that Bitcoin is a futuristic, big growth kind of area. So you might invest into something that piggybacks on the back of that. Or do you stick with something that's well established, but is it still going to keep growing its earnings and making money?
It's a great point, but I always say this is like one thing I discovered quite interesting. When I look at company, I see companies that we are really embedded in their product, we use daily. Over time, they tend to thrive and survive. But when I see companies just relying their price only purely on someone will pay more over time, I see there's a vulnerability here. So MicroStrategy purely remain, Bitcoin bull, someone would pay more for Bitcoin in the future, where companies like Microsoft and Amazon, they are embedded in our system, where their product is tangible. We can see it, where Bitcoin is in your MicroStrategy. You believe he have it somewhere, but we don't see it. So cyber attack can just wipe that out. I think that's the greater risk I see. But historically, I do look through a lot of companies, and the greatest thing I look at for and companies who made billions and for investors are the one who are embedded in our system where we can use them every day. And I think those sort of companies tend to thrive over time.
I think it's fair to say that Awet is a Bitcoin bear here, but Carlo and I aren't. I think that's probably brought us to a nice time to end the show, unless you got any last comments you'd like to make, gentlemen.
I think, just go back to repeat what we said. It's definitely, you probably need to believe in the Bitcoin story to be a fan of MicroStrategy or strategy. I think there's lots of innovation. I think you just got to get your head around. It's not just about buying Bitcoin and hoping the Bitcoin price continues to rise.
Good point.
There's potential for huge innovation to come out of that company with lots of different Bitcoin type products. They're ahead of the game far more than anyone else. I mean, this isn't a case of, Google have got search. Anyone could then make search engine as well. No one's going to be able to get to MicroStrategy's Bitcoin reserves. So if they want to be clever and can find these innovative products, they're ultimately going to be the winner.
Yeah. Any last comments? Awet, to say?
This is a company that you don't want to put all your money in. Just be careful. Just put something
I agree
that
with
you
that.
afford to lose. And I think because it just looks a lot of there's a high risk here element to it. So go for something that you can afford to lose.
I'm a Bitcoin bull, but even I wouldn't put more than 5% of my investable assets into it, and probably nowhere near that, to be perfectly honest. So it's a fair point you made. So thanks for all your comments, gentlemen. I think it was a very stimulating and interesting conversation as ever. We'll put all the links into the show notes as usual. We've got a one-page company snapshot on strategy, which you're welcome to request, and we can supply that to you. If you are following us on Apple Podcasts, please do give us a review. We really, we really rely on you to refer us to other potential listeners. We're always looking for more listeners. So all I can say is thank you, gentlemen, for your attendance today, and thank you for listening. We look forward to the next show. We're going to be discussing a company called Wise, which is a kind of foreign exchange specialist that can move currencies from one country to the other, very low cost, very fast. It's a very, very interesting company, and it's a show you mustn't miss. So we look forward to welcoming you back next time. So without any further ado, bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Please help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with your family and friends. And don't forget to subscribe.